Are you struggling with roadblocks as a woman in the challenging and constantly changing world of corporate America? If you feel stuck in your career, you may be holding yourself back and may not even realize it. Prepare to be enlightened by the meaningful discussions here at the No Woman Left Behind podcast. Each week, gather the insight you need to break down those walls of limiting beliefs. Unleash your full potential and unlock the leader within. Listen to raw conversations with corporate women as they share inspiring stories with the purpose of obtaining their dream career and living a truly fulfilling life. Here's your host, Rosie Zilinskas.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the No Woman Left Behind podcast show. I'm Rosie Zilinskas, your podcast host. Today, we're going to continue our conversation on storytelling. We have Laura Lewis-Barr, and she's going to talk to us about how to become a better storyteller in your career. So let me tell you a little bit about Laura. Laura Lewis-Barr has explored authenticity on theater stages and corporate boardrooms for 20 years. She specializes in helping executives and staff communicate their ideas with humor, vitality, and presence. An award-winning writer, Laura is practicing the art of storytelling and often coaches on perfecting stories to inspire, motivate, and persuade others. She has worked with managers from Chase Bank, Thomson Reuters, Dow Chemical, AOL, Toyota, and many other large and small companies. So a few things that we're going to talk about is how can leaders use storytelling to their advantage? What is the research about storytelling in the brain, and how stories give you a competitive edge when communicating? So these are the things that we're going to be focusing on today's episode. And the reason why, again, we're doing this is because we've already done the negotiation series and you've already done all the hard work. You've already now know your worth, but now how do you actually communicate that to your manager or to a potential employer? And Laura gives us a key on how to use storytelling in your career. I think this is going to be a great episode because, again, Laura has been doing this for many, many years, and she is very eloquent. So stay tuned for Laura Lewis-Barr. Hey everyone, before we go into today's episode, I wanted to remind you that there is a free quiz that you can take on the nowomanleftbehind.com website. If you log on to the homepage and you scroll down just slightly, you're going to see a section that says, let's find out where you are in your career. If you click on the radio button that's called Take the Quiz, there will be a pop-up that comes up and it says, what's the key blocker in your career path? There are 3 key blockers that you may be operating under and you may not even know it. So if you click on just take the quiz, it's going to be about 10 questions. It really shouldn't take you more than 3 minutes. And then you're going to be able to get some additional resources just by taking the quiz. So remember, go to nowomanleftbehind.com to take the free quiz. Hey, Laura, thank you so much for being here on the No Woman Left Behind podcast show. So I know you're a storyteller, and you say that with storytelling, anyone can be a leader. What do you mean by that?
Great first question. Thank you for having me and my froggy throat, froggy voice. I think when we tell stories, we connect with people in a powerful way. And there's been research that when we tell a story, our brains light up fully when we tell a story well, as opposed to when we're giving a factoid, bullet point data. Only the verbal parts of the brain light up. So we're hacking into someone's brain when we tell a story well. And when we can do that, we have the ability to influence, persuade, motivate, which are what leaders are doing, right?
Yeah.
So we can all have that access to that kind of superpower when we tell a story well.
Wow, I love that. I love the fact that you just said it's a superpower because, as you well know, my podcast is focused around women in the corporate world trying to advance in their careers. And I think so often people in the corporate world and the business world, we kind of forget that storytelling is part of a tool of your tool belt that you have to have this superpower and being able to show your value and your worth. And so you and I are recording a 3 or 4 part series on storytelling. I just finished recording, or we published a series on negotiating. So this segues really well into the negotiation, because now if you've done all the work on how to show your worth, now we want to talk about how to actually articulate that. And one of the things that I say is I help women articulate their worth with massive confidence, conviction, and clarity. And I think storytelling is so key in doing that. So how can leaders use storytelling to their advantage more specifically?
Well, as we practice our stories, because you might ask me about this, but storytelling isn't really to do it well, isn't natural to us.
Mm.
In fact, I think our educational process takes us away from that ability. We're all sort of trained to think at the 40,000 feet abstract level. When I go micro and tell a story to you about a small event, then I'm able to build rapport and empathy. And of course, those are also like the building blocks of relationship and leadership. So I think that answered the question you just asked me.
So I guess the question there is when you are a leader, you have to kind of think not just in facts and figures and numbers, but how do those facts impact maybe your customer, right? So do you have any examples on how people can use storytelling to impact their clients or customers?
Yeah, and I guess I want to I can give personal examples, but the best example I have is the President of the United States, who gives a State of the Union, tells stories. And you would sort of think that the president would be giving us huge figures of this massive country we live in. But the brain doesn't work that way. With a customer, I coach a lot of salespeople, and they're always saying, Laura, there's no story here, but we're swimming in story. So there's the story of the client problem that was fixed. There's the story of the client who chose not to use the fix and the terrible thing that happened. There's a story about how the product was developed and why, like when it came, like there's nothing but story. We just don't see it. We're swimming in it.
Wow, that is so incredible. I love that you just said that, because we're so oblivious. We're so focused on, and you talked a little bit about school. We're so focused on memorizing facts and just regurgitating. And then when you regurgitate it, it's gone. Like a lot of people cram for tests, and then you pass the test and then you forget. And I think it's so interesting that when you use those stories, like you said, it lights up different parts of your brain and you remember things more. And I think that's one of the main keys, especially in education, to use stories. And I know I'm also a speaker. A lot of times when you think about a speech, you want to think about it in visuals, in like pictures. And I think it's much easier to remember and be comfortable with giving a speech when you're thinking about it in pictures versus a lot of facts and a lot of, detail that you have to relate. Would you agree with that?
Totally. I think the brain works that way. And the people that have been influential, Jesus, other people, they speak in stories. Yeah. It's always stories. Yeah. And I think I'm partial to the hero's journey sort of as the template of a story. I might be getting ahead of you here.
Yeah, no.
But the how to tell a story is something that and I mentioned this, we're going to practice and practice our stories. And what they have to include that we never include in our daily life is the obstacle, because that is what we're all interested in. How are you living this difficult life? How are you managing job, work, kids? That's why we read novels and go to plays and movies, is we're interested in this heroic journey we're all on, even if in the smallest ways.
Absolutely. And you talked about the hero's journey. So Joseph Campbell, I'm actually re-listening to the book right now. So it's so interesting that you mention it. Now, let's talk a little bit about the research of the brain. What you mentioned it a little bit, but what do you know, or how much have you studied the research of storytelling when it comes to the brain?
Yeah, I have done some studies on that. And I know there's somebody out of Princeton whose name is escaping me in the moment, but his research was saying that when I tell a story well, you and our brains sort of start to sync up. Which is another way of saying hacking into the brain. So all of these, the way we know that the whole brain lights up is MRI studies of people listening to story. And so when we think about the fact that through millennia, before written language, people were listening to story, that might explain why the brain maybe evolved that way. But we do know that stories land in the brain differently. And that's why when you give a presentation, or anybody does, the story is what we remember.
Right, exactly. And I also know people say people may not remember what you said, but they will remember how you made them feel. And it's so interesting. I was watching, I think it was a commercial or something, and I was watching the commercial and I was perfectly fine, emotionally stable. And then all of a sudden I got so emotional with the commercial. I don't even remember what the commercial was, but I do remember that I felt such emotion because it was like a family thing. And my son just moved to Arizona, so I'm missing him. And, so I got so emotional. I'm like, oh my God, it's a stupid commercial. And I just got so emotional with the story just in the commercial. So obviously it was effective.
Yeah, you bring up a really great point in terms of stories sort of imply emotion. And I think that it's funny because those are the two areas that I've focused on in my life, storytelling and emotional intelligence, and they go together very strongly. And they're two things that we want to leave out of the corporate world. Leave my emotion out of it, leave the story out of it. Let's just have the facts. And then we are not reaching each other where we live.
And I think more recently, I have heard where corporations are trying to bring in the whole person into the company, not just the employee, but they're doing, many different companies are doing many different things as far as diversity, equity, inclusion, and health and stuff like that. But you're absolutely right. We are all humans and we are all trying to work at whatever corporation, but sometimes we're so stifled or suffocated by just the business and not really bringing in that emotional intelligence, which is so important, because if you do a proper emotional intelligence study on your team and you figure out what makes each person tick, then you're going to be able to get better productivity out of your team. But you have to go through the process of doing that study, or, whether it's the DISC or the Facet 5 or, the Strengths Finder, whatever different analytics, there is something to be said of treating the employee as a human being with emotions and stories. So I think that's great. Now, I know you say that there is a competitive advantage whenever you're relating to your boss or to other people in the corporate world when you tell stories. What is that competitive advantage, do you think?
Well, when I tell a story, I'm inviting the other person to feel their humanness. And I think when I first started working in emotional intelligence, I was trained to do kind of more childlike, color and games and working with little pieces of wire, kind of physical things. And I went to my instructor and said, how can I do this in the corporate world? How can I do this with CEOs? But I think we're all desperate to feel our humanity. Stories invite that. So they build rapport, they build empathy. And so I have a competitive advantage when I go to that place. It requires me to be vulnerable in a certain way. But when I'm vulnerable, again, it creates a sort of safety and connection with the other person. So it's a huge, and I coach a lot of people for using stories in the interview process, whether I'm interviewing for a new job or a promotion. It's the key way to help me make that deep connection, that memorable connection, so that I'm the one that comes back for the second, third interview and gets that job.
Now, when you say making that connection, how, if someone is listening today and they are either, interviewing right now, or maybe wanting to ask for a raise or a promotion, how can they actually start figuring out where to pull those stories from when it comes to their work? Because I think that's where the disconnect is. So how do you do that with some of your clients?
Right. And here's the advantage I have. I have worked in stories since my childhood, and my background is in the theater. I'm a filmmaker. And so I recognize that there's an arc to a story. There's a journey that we go on in a story, right? And so the journey we want to take our boss on is the challenge we had and how we overcame it. We never tell the challenge. We just say, like I might say to you, I made a full-length film in 2010. So what? If I tell you the journey of that, now we have the really tough challenge, because our stories have to be brief in the business world. Yeah. We're not giving a TED talk.
Right.
So this is one of the reasons why we have to practice, because we want to take someone on a quick journey, but a powerful journey. And so a few key moments of my struggle, some key images that I'm going to put in your brain about my struggle and how I overcame it. That's the basic formula. We're going to have to give a little backstory so that they know what we're talking about. But this is where we get hung up, when storytellers give so much backstory. We've all been there. Someone launches a story, they're going on and on. We don't know where the story's going, and they've lost us. So a little backstory, the obstacle, and how we overcame it is one formula.
Got it. Now, it almost sounds to me like, so when I worked years ago, I worked with a professional resume writer, and it was kind of a similar process, because I went in with my resume that was like 10 years old or whatever. I started talking to her. She asked me a lot of questions. I answered them. And then when she gave me my resume, it was this beautiful work of art. It sounds like that's similar to what you do with your clients.
I love that. I think that our stories should be works of art. So we practice them out loud a bunch of times, and we find out, what is vital to take us on that journey. So working with my clients, especially for interview coaching, one thing I notice is that clients have to tell me a bunch of stories, and a lot of them they would never tell it in an interview. But they have to get them out, right? And so but the other thing that I also notice is, we're all so hard on ourselves. We're all so brutal on ourselves. And we don't see the heroic journey we've taken. We don't see the heroism in our everyday lives. And so I think what screenwriters do, or writers, novelists do, is sometimes they have a skill to take the ordinary and elevate it so that we can see. I mean, so you mentioned being a mom.
Mm-hmm.
You swim in the heroism of that role constantly.
Yes.
And there are a zillion stories that you could use, even in business. Not always, but I think there are moments, because if you tell a story about raising your son that has a parallel to the work we do, you're going to connect with all the parents. And I don't have kids, but I have a dog.
Mm-hmm.
I connect
Right.
to the raising of Reggie. So
yeah, I like that. Now, I think the key thing there is you almost have to sit down and brainstorm to just come up with a lot of different stories. And so the way I tell my clients to do that is there's behavioral interview questions. So I tell them, listen, when you're at home on the weekend and you're watching TV, grab your laptop, research behavioral interview questions and make sure that you have a story for each question. And it could be like 30 random questions. You're going to, what that does, it accelerates your brain to think about things that you haven't thought about in years. And I'm like, write it down, either physically write it down or type it, whatever, because then that jogs your memory on different examples that you can use during the interview. And I think that's what you're saying is make sure that you look at the mundane, the things that you may not think are a big deal, but it could be a good example of a story to use in the interview, right?
brilliant. Yes. So the only things I would add to that is we have to practice them out loud, which nobody
Yes.
wants to do because we feel like dorky,
Yeah.
but we got to do it because the brain and the mouth are separate, right? And the other thing I do with clients, if they're going for a job, is to use that job description for the stories. The interview is telling you everything that they care about. Use that and find stories for each of those things.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense too. I really like that. Now, you said that I guess, designed story has 3 parts. Let's go through those 3 parts again, and then tell us some other tips that you usually use with your clients when you're putting together a story.
Yeah, so we need the basic context, right? So the who, what, where, maybe, but it's usually much briefer than we do. That's a huge struggle for clients. My clients is to recognize I don't need all that backstory. I really, really don't. What is the story about? Just give me those basics. The other thing I coach people on is recognizing that a story is usually one moment in time. Couldn't find that word. one moment in time, not in general. And so we have to force ourselves not to talk in generally how we work with our clients, but talk about the time that I had Joe. Okay, so we want to use names and numbers to make a story land. So Joe and I worked for interview coaching, and he had left a job in a bad way. He had had a bad ending, and he was really terrified about doing the interview process and how he was going to deal with that scary question of what happened in your last job. Why did you leave? And so we practiced. First, he told me, what actually happened. And he was feeling so bad about it, but I could see in the story how heroically he had tried. So the focus of the story was not to trash his previous employer. God
Right.
knows we can't ever do that. But to really give the facts of what happened and how he dealt with them. And he recognized he actually had a beautiful story to tell. So I just pivoted there because I was doing what I said not to do, which is to talk in general. We have to talk specifically, and that's the struggle, is to get out of the macro and get to the micro. And then we end the story generally with, what's the story about? Some stories are very, very complicated, and we have to work hard to figure out how we're going to end it. But we don't have to give the listener every single event that happened A to Z. We can
Right.
jump anywhere we want.
Right. I think a lot of times that is the biggest issue, is that you have, say an event that happens to you and you want to tell every little thing that happened, and it's just so overwhelming. And sometimes people, specifically people that are interviewing, the interviewers typically, if they have 5 minutes to look at your resume before you actually sit in front of them, that's a lot. A lot of people are like, I have 30 seconds to just look at the summary and just kind of, graze through the resume, and that's all I have. So when you are telling those stories, you're absolutely right. You have to be to the point. You have to be concise, to the point, and get your point across without all of the stuff that is not necessary. I don't know if you've seen the commercial. It's a commercial about they're advertising a vehicle. I don't even know what kind of vehicle it is, but the commercial starts with a young man, and he gets in his brand new car, and his mom is on the phone, and he's taking a really long ride. And the mom just keeps talking and talking, and she's giving him so many details. And this poor man, he's just like, uh-huh, uh-huh, uh-huh. And she's like, are you listening to me? Do you want me to repeat that? He's like, no, don't repeat it. Because it was like 45 minutes of this woman just talking. And that is a good commercial, because you can relate to situations where you just need to just give me the information that I need. Don't give me all of the details and backstory, because I don't have time for that. So
Right. And it reminds me back to what we were saying. It's a work of art. And so there's a couple of things there. One is, I think people are so sincere that they want to give me every single moment because that's what really happened.
Mm-hmm.
But in art is art because we're changing it from the way life is.
Right.
We're not lying ever.
Right.
We're just giving the gist of the truth. So if my story contains a conversation I had with a client, I'm not transcribing word for word.
Right.
I'm giving the gist.
Right. Well, and again, a work of art. I mean, literally, if you go to I live in Chicago, so if you go to the Chicago Art Institute and you walk around, every single painting has a story. And a lot of times I have no idea what the story could have been, but a lot of times it's very obvious. So I think, to your point, an artist paint something and they have this whole story in their head as to what they want to create, and then they have one picture or one work of art to display, and then you can the person looking at it then interprets it, which is the interviewee and the interviewer role. So you're trying to give them the best of you, and then the interviewer is trying to receive the best of you and try to make sure it's a good fit so that you can get hired, hopefully.
Yeah. And I think to practice and create that work of art, that small story that really illustrates who you are, and to take that time in that interview. So when the interviewer says, tell me about yourself, you don't go into factoid things in your resume, but you launch into a beautiful story that you've prepared.
Oh,
you will become super memorable.
That's so key, because I mean, when someone says to you, tell me about yourself, and that's actually why I don't use that framework for our podcast, because if you noticed at the beginning of our podcast, I didn't say, hi, Laura, tell me about yourself, I kind of went straight into a question, because although I'm interested to learn about you and I will ask you about yourself, I don't want people to go like, well, I was born in, 1969. And then tell me about yourself is so ambiguous that you really need to hone in on what it is that you want to showcase. And I think that this conversation is so critically important for anyone in the corporate world that is trying to do some kind of goal, whether it's, again, getting a promotion, getting, a raise, because you have to go and show your worth. And the way you're going to do it is through word, through communication, and primarily through story. So absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
Now I know, what is the relation between empathy, rapport, and storytelling?
Yeah. So we have mentioned this before, is that when I'm telling a story well about my struggle, the listener immediately feels some empathy because they struggle.
Mm.
And that builds rapport. Empathy and rapport are kind of together, right? We feel closer, which is why we have to bring emotions into the workplace,
Yeah.
because it's the only way to talk about, what if I have to have a difficult conversation with
Yeah.
someone and I'm just giving the facts? That's one way. But
Mhm.
if I say, I'm really struggling to communicate with you, Amy, because we've been here before, we've had this tough conversation before, and I'm really scared, or I'm really concerned, or I'm really frustrated. Those words build empathy and rapport.
Yeah.
Even though it's difficult, my emotions, you have emotions, we have emotions.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Yeah. And just to be able to recognize that the manager is not the end all be all, because again, managers are human beings and they have feelings too. I know I talked to one of my guests in the negotiation series, and they said one of the things that they do is, as a manager, when they are going to be having a difficult conversation, they will start with something like, just as an example, hey, Sarah, I have observed some things that I would like to share with you. Is it okay if I share that information with you? So it's almost like asking permission, asking for their agreement to have that conversation, that two-way conversation. Because if you just approach somebody and said, hey, you're screwing up, I mean, it's a very different way of approaching, and you can reach that person to buy into you wanting to help them. But there has to be that back and forth emotional path between the manager and the employee.
Right. And I think the more the manager can bring forward their own emotional state. So, Helen, I know our last conversation was a bit of a struggle. I feel a little nervous, but are you willing to try again?
Oh,
Like
yeah.
bringing myself into it. So I'm not like the God, right?
Right.
I'm a person. Yeah.
Right. Yes. I love that. So I used to be a manager, and one of the things that I did when one of my coworkers, because I always call him coworker, even though we had different levels, they would walk into my office and my computer would be facing one away from the door. And then when they would come in, I would physically turn my body, to
Mm.
them, so that they knew that I was looking at them. And that had such a difference in relating to the person and me treating them as an individual. And I also remember sometimes I would walk in first thing in the morning, I'm like sitting down, this is when we were all back in the offices, sitting down, putting my stuff away, coat away, whatever. Someone would walk in and ask me a question, and now the first thing I would say is, good morning, Sarah, or good morning, Jim, or whatever, because acknowledge me as a person first and then ask me the question, so I wouldn't care if they're like, hey, Rosie, how are you? And then like, literally, I have a question, I have someone on the phone. So, but acknowledge me as a person first and then go into your questions.
Right. I mean, I think some of us who are really task oriented forget that. And yeah, it's some of that WD-40 that we need to grease our relationships with each other and make it smooth. Yeah.
Absolutely. So obviously you have a lot of experience into storytelling. So now I do want to hear a little bit about your journey. You said that you have been pretty much storytelling since you were a child.
Yes.
How did you know as you were growing up that that's what you were focusing on, and then you were able to now coach people with storytelling? So I'd like to know about your story now.
Yeah. Sometimes I think for myself and maybe others, stories reveal themselves in retrospect, right? So it wasn't that I knew. I just now, as I think about it, I was telling stories as a kid, and theater was my vehicle. So I got my degrees in theater. I taught theater and public speaking for many, many years. And so for me, story has always been both fiction and nonfiction. There's been my work as a playwright, screenwriter, filmmaker, and then my work with clients in the nonfiction, but they're all story. And I know that my fiction work really informs my ability to help other people craft and recognize the arc of their own stories. And there's such a power to recognize that I'm living a heroic story. And that's just, I think, really elevates. I mean, there's something almost religious about recognizing that my life is meaningful. There are stories here. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. Now, when did you start coaching clients with storytelling?
I'd say about 15 years ago, I left college teaching. Maybe it's longer now, but let's just say 15. That's a good number. And yeah. And then I moved into corporate training and did all sorts of emotional intelligence, communication training. And certainly when COVID hit, then it was all just online and the one-on-one. I was doing one-on-one before that, but there is nothing like that Zoom intimacy when you're with just one person.
Right.
And I did a lot of interview coaching then and still do.
Got it. Now you're an award-winning writer. I'd like to know what did you write and what was your award that you received?
I've received a number of awards for screenwriting and playwriting.
Okay.
So yeah, film festival awards or awards from theaters or colleges regarding my writing. Yeah.
The reason I ask is because obviously you're an award-winning writer, and with storytelling, it's so important. Now, were you on theater stage like in high school, college, or were you behind the scenes in the theater?
I was a performer for years, and musical comedy was sort of one of the things I loved doing. But I think my skill is more directing, writing than performing. I saw that pretty early on, and then corporate training became sort of a wonderful way back to be on the stage, as you know, and do this little edutainment where you make the training fun. And so all my theater skills are always being utilized.
That's awesome. Now, we talked about emotional intelligence, right? When it comes to emotional intelligence, I want you to explain just a little bit, what exactly is emotional intelligence and how can people use it in their stories?
So, EI is recognizing that our emotions themselves have an intelligence that we can utilize. So when I feel afraid, when I feel angry, there's a message there for me that is really important to decode, because our emotions are there as a guide. They're our internal GPS. And when we ignore them, we lose this valuable information. And likewise for managers, when they ignore the emotions of their team, they're losing incredibly valuable information, or the emotions of their clients. So in terms of storytelling, well, there's so much. In terms of presenting our stories, when our amygdala is firing, that's the emotional center of the brain. When that's firing, we don't think as well. Our verbal centers sort of get shut down by the fight flight. So as we work with our emotions, we can not be maybe so run by them and get more access to our higher thinking brain.
So we're essentially using our emotions to figure out how to tell our story better.
Right. Like we're recognizing. So let's say I'm terrified of speaking, and many of us struggle with that. So I'm terrified that I'm going to forget what I was going to say. And so I can work with the fear and practice my presentation so I feel less afraid, so I get more confidence. And then I start to recognize that I'm not forgetting things because I'm more relaxed as I speak. So instead of just ignoring that fear, recognizing where it comes from, what can I do about it?
Right. And I think the what can I do about it is, as you've said many times, practice,
Yes.
practice, because that's the way you're going to feel comfortable telling the story. And I don't know, what is it, like 70 or 80% of people are afraid of public speaking. That's like the number one fear, of people in the world.
Yeah.
So it's really important to be able to practice. And the more you practice, the more natural it is and the less you forget, because I find that sometimes when I do my same signature talk, I may forget a little piece here and there. So it's not always like perfect because I don't have notes and I'm not reading stuff or whatever. So I might forget, one thing that I was like, oh, I forgot that. But nobody knows what I was going to say anyway, really. So it's okay. But I have noticed that the more I do my talk, the more natural it is that now I'm incorporating all the important pieces of the conversation that I wanted to incorporate. But it does definitely take practice. So I know we talked about the classic story template. Is that what we opened with as far as like the 3-part template for a story?
Yeah. I make it into 4, but I think 3 is actually easier to remember.
Yeah.
So just the context, the obstacle, and the resolution, right?
Which actually, every single movie and play and even songs a lot of times have that, if I can understand lyrics, because it depends on the genre. Like hip hop, I have no clue.
Right.
But well, I really appreciate everything that you have shared. Now, obviously, you are coaching clients. If someone in the corporate world wanted to work with you, do you work with corporate clients in order to advance their career, whether again it's interviewing or talking to the manager or anything like that? What kind of coaching do you do for them?
Right. So I coach one-on-one and I go into companies. So
Okay.
when I go into companies, what's really cool is if we do a public speaking workshop, that storytelling becomes really a central part of it. I've done a few recently. The coworkers and the manager hear each other's stories, some stories they've never heard before. So it becomes not only learning about storytelling and public speaking, but it becomes almost a retreat for the group because they're spending the day hearing each other's stories. It's really powerful.
That's so cool. And so we have your website. I will go ahead and link your website to the episode blog so that if anybody wanted to reach out to you, they could. Well, Laura, you have given us some tremendous information. And I typically ask my guests if there's maybe 2 actionable tips that you can provide the listeners that they can use in their either their life or their corporate careers.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but I think the repetition is good to
Yeah.
say that practice our stories out loud and then tell them. Tell stories, tell short stories. The more we tell, the more we will remember, the more we will see stories that we can incorporate every day. It'll just become, not the water that's invisible, but the water that we're swimming in very consciously.
I love that. And again, we had the negotiating series, and now we're doing the storytelling series. And I think it's so important because you need to know you need to know your worth, your value. And by what I mean by that is knowing your skills, knowing how much you want to get paid, knowing what you want, asking for what you want. So those are like the concrete things that you're going after. And now the beauty about this is that now with the storytelling, you now know that you need to make those things as concise and precise as possible so that you have a good story when you go in and talk to whomever you're going to talk to. So I think this has been fabulous, Laura. So thank you. Any final words that you want to leave our listeners with?
I guess the final word is we are all living beautiful. Sometimes our struggles can be beautiful and our stories can be beautiful. And the more we tell them, the more we create connection in our world with each other.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you again, Laura, so much for your time. I really appreciate you coming on the show. And I hope that everybody has really paid attention to this because this has been a very important conversation. So thank you.
Thanks, Rosie.
Some of the takeaways that I got out of this great conversation with Laura is that storytelling is a superpower. So often we forget that we can pair up storytelling with emotional intelligence, and it really resonates whenever we're using those in the corporate world. She also says that when you're telling a story and you're being vulnerable, it shows your humanity. And again, that makes you relatable. A good story has three parts. The first part is a very short backstory. The second part is the obstacle. And the third part is how do you get over that obstacle? What is the solution? And you also want to make sure that the story is a moment in time and not over an entire several years. It's one moment in time, and use names and numbers to make sure that the story lands really well. Another thing that she said is to use the job description so that you can choose the right stories to match the job description. Because if you're using stories that highlight those skills that they're looking for in the job description, then you're a sure thing to at least get a call back. Now, Laura does provide us with 2 tips. Tip number 1 is practice the story out loud. So practice the story and do it out loud. And then tip number 2 is tell the story to family, friends, your spouse, kids. And by doing so, you might get some good feedback from your family and friends on if the story is too long or too short, or maybe you need to put in some more names and numbers in the story. All of Laura's contact information is going to be on the episode website. So if you go on Apple and click on the episode website, it's going to land you right into the episode land page. And from there, you can look at the YouTube, you can look at the transcription, or you can listen to Laura's episode. Again, great information that Laura shared. I was very appreciative that she could spend time with us today. And with that, remember to be brave, be bold, and take action.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Let these stories of self-encouragement and professional development serve as a guide in navigating through corporate America in the most practical and fulfilling way possible. Do not forget to subscribe to the show at nowomanleftbehind.com for more content like this. Leave a rating and share it with your friends, because we want to make sure that no woman is left behind. Until I see you next time, remember to be brave, be bold, and take action.